rodents and mice. How much of a carryover is there, that data versus human data?
How neurons fire, how they communicate with each other in a rat brain is about the way that it works in our brains too.
He's different people throughout the day, like different versions of himself.
That's putting a chronobiology lens on your behavior. So in a way, your jujitsu, if you do jujitsu every day, that's in and of itself a circadian rhythm.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to Good People episode 10. Before we get started, I just want to pat myself on the back. Pat came in on the back. We've reached episode 10. In today's episode, I talked to Dr. Jeff Dyche. He is a Department of Psychology professor at James Madison University. He studies chronobiology, and more specifically, his research focuses on sleep and sleep deprivation. Today, we talked about sleep, circadian rhythms, and if naps are a good substitute for people who don't get enough sleep at night. It was a super interesting episode. I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I did. Before we get this episode started, if you are watching on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on post notifications so you never miss an episode.
Welcome to the show. Thank you for taking part in this immersive listening experience. A meaningful existence is a moving target that, no matter how close, will always be out of reach. We hope this message finds you with an outstretched hand. As we attempt to uncover complex truths, remember, life's toughest questions can be answered if we all just focus on one thing: being good people.
Alrighty, Dr. Jeff Dyche, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Okay, let's get started with what's a brief overview of what it is that you study. I understand your research covers a very broad spectrum of topics and ideas, but just general overview of what it is that you study.
Well, the one thing that's kind of pulls most of the stuff that I do together is sleep and circadian rhythms. I'm a sleep researcher. Some of the stuff that I do is more what we would call psychopharmacology, which is the effects of drugs on behavior. But usually these behaviors that I'm looking at when it comes to chronic administration of certain drugs is the behavior is usually sleep. And that's one of the main things I look at. And so that's kind of the big picture. I'm a sleep and circadian rhythms or sleep and chronobiology researcher.
Cool. How did you fall upon sleep as a topic of interest?
Well, that's a good question. I've kind of wondered how I just became a sleep researcher, because my master's degree was in sensation and perception, and it wasn't sleep. But after I finished my master's degree, I knew I didn't want to be a perception researcher, and I found a person who was recruiting people with that had experience working with animals, and most of my research up until fairly recently is using non-human animals like rats or mice to study sleep. And so I had experience with that, and so I kind of shifted gears after I got my master's degree to get a PhD in sleep and sleep physiology. Just because, everybody's interested in sleep, and that was something that I've always was curious about. And so I decided when I was in my mid to late 20s to shift gears and pursue sleep as a research career.
Yeah. I've always had this question about researchers in general. When people research rodents and mice specifically, how much of a carryover is there to like that data versus human data? I just see a lot of studies where I'm like, the conclusion is this, but then it's, oh, this was done on rodents. How much is that carryover usually? I'm sure it depends on the variables that you're looking at, but.
Yeah, some basic processes that in neuroscience that we have an understanding on, like how neurons fire, and how they communicate with each other. These are basic processes that evolution has conserved across, millions of years. And so we know that, or we can be pretty confident that the way a neuron communicates with another neuron in a rat brain is about the way that it works in our brains too. But when it comes to more complex things, things in psychology, particularly in abnormal psychology, you want to talk about severe mental disorders like schizophrenia, it's a little more of a stretch to find an animal model that matches some human diseases. Having said that, about 92% of our genes we share with rodents and with rats in particular. And so, if you want to look at it genetically, the chances are pretty good that what's true in a mouse or a rat would be true in you or I.
Cool. Hopefully that humbles people hearing that we're not very far off of mice or rodents.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking. I mean, even in a fruit fly, about 75% of genes that regulate disorders, you find an analog in fruit flies. And so it is humbling. It is
Yeah,
humbling.
that's crazy. So the term is chronobiology. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
What is that? Can you define that?
Yes, that's the science of circadian rhythms. And these are the processes that ebb and flow across a 24-hour period. And some would say chronobiology is the science of biological rhythms, which includes rhythms that ebb and flow across time periods that are less than 24 hours. Like hunger, for example. Hunger is a rhythm that we have. It's a biological rhythm that we experience more than one time a day for most cultures. Similarly, there's other rhythms that last longer than a day. And so these would be not circadian rhythms, but other types of biological rhythms like monthly rhythms. Some people have yearly rhythms. But most chronobiologists study circadian rhythms, and these are biological processes that peak and trough across a 24-hour period.
Cool. Something that I'm curious about in regards to that is, and we'll get to circadian rhythm as it relates to sleep in a second, but you said it's like 24-hour period. I listened to a podcast fairly recently about this guy saying, and it was totally anecdotal, talking about his own life, that he feels like he's different people throughout the day, like different versions of himself throughout the day. And that's something that I relate a lot to. And I'll give an example of my life. I do jujitsu. That's one of my main hobbies. And jujitsu classes from 6:30 to 8 p.m. And I am a fitness trainer as my career. And I am the guy who preaches consistency, discipline, etc. And I have no problem showing up to go do a workout in the morning. But in the evening, just the person that I am, or that is more out in the evening, is the guy. That guy has a hard time going to jujitsu because of fatigue or whatever. And I'm curious if it kind of sounded like something in that line that you said of there's various things that are sort of on this pattern. Is that something that you have noticed or seen maybe in yourself or others as well?
Well, I think that's an interesting way to look at the behaviors that we have that vary as a function of the time of the day. I mean, some people identify as morning people, and that's something that chronobiologists are interested in. Some people identify as morning people, and they may be more likely to do their workouts in the mornings. Other people are more evening types, and so that's when they want to engage in certain activities. So yeah, I mean, I think that's I've not looked at it from that perspective, but that's a good way. That's putting a chronobiology lens on your behavior across the day, and that's so in a way, your jujitsu. If you do jujitsu every day, that's in and of itself a circadian rhythm.
Yeah, that's cool. I've never really thought about it from that perspective, but
yeah, that's really interesting.
In regards to circadian rhythm, this is something that I think is getting thrown around a lot in terms of, obviously this is your world, you research it a lot, but people are posting about sleep health and stuff like that on social media. There's things like sleep coaches that are becoming a big thing. I'm not sure if you are, I guess, in tune with that side of things. But my question is, what is a circadian rhythm as it relates to sleep? Is circadian rhythm the sleep rhythm, or is circadian rhythm more broad?
Yeah, the sleep. I mean, that's another good question. I think of sleep as a behavior that, for most people, it's a circadian rhythm. I mean, some people, and they're rare, but they'll have like 2 sleep cycles across the period. In some European cultures and some South American cultures, there's more than 1 sleep period, and so that technically would. You could argue that it's not a circadian rhythm, but even people that have multiple sleeps across a 24-hour period, there's usually one larger consolidated sleep, like the way most people in our culture do it. And so that's we do this once every 24 hours at about the same time. Circadian means about a day, and so we sleep at about the same time, about the same amount of time every day. So that's why it's a circadian rhythm.
How does that work? Is that what you're like trying to uncover? Like, what is the process for, okay, it's 8 p.m. I normally fall asleep at this time?
Yeah, there's a structure in your brain. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it's in another part of the brain that people are probably familiar with or more familiar with, and that's the hypothalamus. And this is the quote unquote master clock. And we know that and it's abbreviated, we'll call it the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And this structure is considered the master clock because we know in animals, if we ablate or destroy this very small brain structure in an animal, they no longer have circadian rhythms. And their sleep behavior will be randomly scattered across a 24-hour period. There's no consolidation into the day or the night, which is typical for almost every other species. So there's a clock. There's a clock in our head that tells us, it's 8 o'clock. It's time for dinner, or it's midnight. It's time for sleep. And without this clock in our head, that behavior disappears.
Right. Is that why it's important? Like, it will literally are you saying sleep as a behavior will disappear if we don't have consistency with the pattern?
And the behavior, the sleep won't disappear. You'll still sleep about the same amount, but it won't be consolidated. For example, for us humans, we tend to sleep in the evenings at night. And so if the SCN were destroyed, then theoretically we would sleep throughout the 24-hour period, just throughout the day. It would still be 8 hours, but it would be, like 20 minutes here, 20 minutes there. And this is based on animal studies.
Okay. You said SEN?
SCN, suprachiasmatic nucleus.
Okay, I understand. I guess my question is an underlying, why do we need this pattern to regulate consistency in our lives?
Yeah, and that's a good reason. And the reason why is because this behavior has benefited our ancestors. And there are other species who benefited by sleeping during the day, and these are nocturnal animals, and they survive better by sleeping at certain times. And that kind of begets another question, and it points to the importance of sleep, because evolutionarily it would be advantageous if we could just get rid of sleep completely. But we haven't found an animal that's gotten rid of sleep, because animals, when they fall asleep, that's when they're subject to predation. And it would be great if we could figure out a way to get rid of sleep. And, when some of the research that I was involved with when I was in the Navy, we were trying to figure out if there was a way that a person could go like a week without any sleep. And the answer was no.
Yeah. We're going to get to sleep deprivation in a second, but is it just almost a reward pattern thing of, this worked out well for me in a human's case? Maybe it's, we can't work at night, so we're going to keep doing this.
Yeah, but I think we're hardwired to be diurnal species, or where we're designed. We humans are designed to be awake during the day and sleep at night, and we can do otherwise. We can, shift workers do this all the time. They'll say, oh, well, I'm going to make my day night and my night day. And you can do that, but you're not going to be at 100%. And other processes will probably fail, and including your immune system, which has its own circadian rhythms. And we know that people that work this shift, that work the third shift, the night shift, that try to live like a nocturnal animal, we know that they're subject to being sick. They die earlier, and they are more likely to have cancer.
That's insane. I know a bunch of people who are like overnight nurses, and they tell me their schedule, and I'm just like, I cannot imagine doing that.
Right. Nurses that have been, and physicians, other healthcare workers have been studied pretty closely, and the World Health Organization has now officially listed working the night shift as a carcinogen.
That's insane.
It is, and yet the 24/7, ethos is important to our culture.
Yeah. I actually do have some questions about that later on too, but let's talk about sleep deprivation for a second. I understand this is an area that you've looked at is relatively recently, correct?
I've been looking at sleep deprivation since for quite a while. I was looking, again, when I was in the Navy, we looked at the effects of sleep deprivation on submariners.
Okay. Sleep deprivation in general, is it something that just comes down to a person's not getting enough sleep?
Yeah. I mean, everybody has there's kind of a number, and some people are shorter sleepers and others are longer sleepers. But if you can find that number, and that's the target, and for optimal performance, optimal behavior, and I'm talking like cognitive processes, but also other physiological processes like your immune functioning, like I was mentioning before. I mean, they need a certain amount of sleep.
Okay. And with that, are there other factors that contribute to a good night's rest that are pretty specific that would not necessarily contribute to sleep deprivation, but keep you away from being sleep deprived? Does that question make sense?
I'm not sure. When you say other factors,
like, do you separate time slept versus quality of sleep versus continuity of sleep, things like that?
yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the conundrum, the qualitative versus quantitative, because some people would say that quantitative is what you should focus on. You need to get that number, but others would say, well, you need to look at the stages of sleep. That you would need to have EEGs hooked up to your brain to figure out what stage of sleep you're in. And so some would say you need to get a certain amount of deep sleep or a certain amount of REM sleep to know for sure that you've gotten the right amount of sleep. And this is an issue that, when I go to these sleep conferences, this is part of the discussion. That's what drives the science.
Is there a side that you fall on that?
I not really. I probably, if I were to choose a side, I would choose on the side of the total amount of sleep, total sleep time. Just because, maybe because of my bias, because most of the research I've done, I don't look at the stage of sleep. I just look at the amount of sleep. But others would say, well, then you're not getting the full spectrum. That's a limitation, and that's something that every scientific study has its limitations, and so those are limitations. That's a limitation of the stuff that I do in my lab.
I know that this is a blanket statement, and especially as a researcher, probably don't like doing blanket statements, but is there a time frame that you would recommend people shoot for?
Yeah, I mean, I would go along with what the National Sleep Foundation indicates, and that's that most people need between about 7 to 8 hours of sleep. A younger person, a college student, probably you would extend that to 7 to 9 hours. Some would say 8 to 9 hours, and until you're about in your mid-20s, you probably need 8 to 9, and then by the mid-20s, it drops a little bit to 7 or 8 hours. And so that's for some people they need more than that, and for those people that need more than 8 hours of sleep a night, they're going to be subject to cultural insults. The people will say, if you're spending too much time in your bed, you're considered lazy.
Yeah.
And so, but it's not their fault. But that's just the way our culture is operating.
Yeah. I'll give you an example. I feel like I'm okay after I sleep 7 hours, and my girlfriend, she needs like 9 or 9.5 sometimes. And if she sleeps less than that, I can tell like, oh, she just didn't get a lot of sleep last night, which is insane to me.
Yeah, right. And there are some short sleepers, and and the Navy's co-sponsored some of these studies where they're trying to find people that need less than 6 hours of sleep. And one thing and there's not very many people that fall into that category. I mean, there are people that claim to only need 4 or 5 hours of sleep, but if you give them the opportunity to sleep longer, they'll take it. But the people that are short sleepers oftentimes view society as people that our society is awash with lazy people. All they're doing, they're wasting their time sleeping. But and woe to the people that need 9 or 10 hours, like your girlfriend.
Yeah, and is that something that? So if we look at those short sleepers, is there any research on the longevity in terms of lifespan where, because they're short sleepers, that means that they are getting adequate quality of sleep in a shorter time frame? Is that what you mean by that?
The people that even if you give them the opportunity to sleep longer than 6 hours, they won't take it.
Okay.
And they'll bring people into these labs at the University of California, San Diego. They're bringing people into these labs and letting them sleep. They were supposed short sleepers, and most of them, when they came into the lab, they slept longer than 6 hours. And so they examined people that sleep less than 6 hours. And to answer your question, there's no experimental evidence because we haven't been, you can't do an experiment with long sleepers versus short sleepers, but you can do correlational studies. And one thing that we found with correlational studies is that short sleepers, very short sleepers, people that sleep 6 hours or less, and long sleepers who sleep 9 hours or more, have shorter lifespans. And we don't know why that's the case, but there's some speculation, and it's correlational data, of course. But that's a consistent finding: is that very short sleepers and very long sleepers have shorter lives.
This kind of brought up two questions in my head. The first one is, I've heard that male to female, females tend to sleep a bit longer. Is this consistent with what you have researched?
Yes, that's there are people who specialize in sleep in women, and they'll find that it's about 20 minutes more. Women were more like need a little bit more sleep than men, but for all intents and purposes, for most research studies, you can combine men and women because we're really the same. We're the same species, and it's just one. For the most part, the difference is just one chromosome, and so that begets other questions. But yeah, and it's a consistent finding that women need slightly more sleep than men, but the difference is not very big.
Okay. That prompted me to ask that question because of your statement about short sleepers versus long sleepers. I was curious. I also think that women tend to live a little bit longer than men in a lot of cases. I was just curious I wonder if there's a connection between those two things.
Well, that's a really interesting question. And again, we know that they're correlated. There's a correlation with being a woman and living longer than men. And, but we can't establish a cause and effect relationship.
Okay, cool. What are the long-term effects of sleep deprivation?
Well, the long-term effects of sleep deprivation, if you're sleep deprived, it's a stressor. And if you're stressed, you produce, the various hormones like cortisol, which are bad for the long-term exposure to cortisol is bad for a number of health indexes, like muscle development and stuff like that. There's also there's inflammatory cytokines, and there's a number of other inflammatory responses that are a function of stress. And sleep deprivation is a stressor, and so what exactly is what happens to people that sleep short, that are short sleepers or sleep deprived? They're more likely to develop a number of disorders. And one thing that's been a focus on in the popular media and the literature as well, to a certain extent, is people that take sleeping pills, whether over the counter or prescription, are more likely to develop certain forms of dementia. And this is kind of a hot topic right now. But again, it's correlational data.
Okay. So you're saying with that, people who take sleeping pills are in essence getting what's the way I'm trying to word it? They are getting the sleep, but they're not getting the restful sleep.
Well, the thought is that if you're taking sleeping pills, you're having problems sleeping, or the person that's taking them, needs at least they feel like they need assistance from pharmacology to help them sleep. And so, you're making some assumptions about their sleep patterns, but that they're having problems sleeping. And so that means usually that they're not getting enough sleep, that it's the number issue. And so they take medications to boost the number, help them to get more sleep. But the data would indicate that people that do this are more likely to develop, for example, Alzheimer's.
Okay. Are there any certain things that would point to people being able to improve their sleep, whether time or quality?
Yeah, there's a number of people. I'm not a clinical sleep psychologist, but they're behavioral sleep medicine psychologists. They're sometimes referred to as, and one thing that they'll stress is trying to have what they'll call good chrono hygiene. Mm-hmm. And that is, try and go to bed at the same time and get up at the same time. And people that do this, that develop a routine, they tend to have better sleep. And so trying to do that is it's easier. You know, for some people, they'll be like, oh my God, I should have done this much sooner because this has improved my sleep massively. Others, you know, struggle to, you know, because of their lifestyle or their careers or whatever, you know, it's hard for them to have good chrono hygiene. It's hard to go to bed at the same time if your shifts are shifting all the time.
Going to bed at the same time. Are there any other things that people can do?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's gotten some media attention because it's pretty well established in the literature, and that is light at night. And you want to avoid light at least 2 hours before you want to initiate sleep. And in our world with our iPhones, our iPads, and even, you know, computer screens, you know, we're looking at this up until the bewitching hour, and this suppresses the production of this hormone that helps you initiate sleep, and that's melatonin.
Okay. Are there any sort of I wear this. I'm actually not wearing it right now. I wear this thing called a Whoop. It's a tracker that tracks my sleep, among other things. But it gives me my HRV. It gives me my skin temperature while I sleep, my resting heart rate, my respiration rate, a bunch of factors, and then it like measures the time or the zones that I'm in, and gives me, based off of my activity from the day before, this sleep score of how efficient my sleep was. I'm curious if you've ever used one, looked at that, if you know people who have researched this, and if you feel like that using trackers or things like that to help educate people on their own sleep would be a productive use of money, time, things like that.
Yeah, well, I track my sleep all the time, also in part because when I teach a class at JMU called Sleep and Chronobiology, and I make all the students track their sleep for a whole semester. So I started doing this many years ago, and it's, you know, it's kind of cool, and it provides some information as to how much sleep you're getting, and some of these other factors like heart rate or things like this. These are interesting, and I think it's edifying, and I think for the most part, all else being equal, these trackers are good, are doing more good than bad. But I don't think they're these trackers you wear on your wrist aren't going to diagnose a sleep disorder or something like that. And some people think that that it can do that, but for the most part, you need a full, you know, polysomnographic, you know, hookup to find out the real nuances of your sleep and what's going on there. But I mean, for healthy people like yourself, I mean, I think they're really cool. And I use my Apple Watch. I use its tracker, and I have other software programs. One that's called Pillow that I use, that some of my students have used, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, with that, I'm curious about this. I almost think of it like it was a way for me to experiment on myself. I have come to the pretty sure conclusion that if I eat a lot of food right before I go to bed, that with the data that I've collected over the weeks and months that I've used it of my tracker, I will not sleep as well if I did not eat right before bed. I've talked to people who use the same tracker, and if they eat before bed, they feel like they sleep better. Now, I probably didn't even need my tracker to know that. Like if I ate food right before bed and I went to sleep, I could probably wake up and be like, yeah, I feel horrible. And if I chose not to eat and then I went to sleep, and I would feel a lot better, right? And so, not necessarily required to use a tracker, but do you feel like there's a bit of a individualization to each person's sleep that they should become aware of?
Yeah, you mean as far as like eating late at night or something like that?
Yeah, or any other habit, like insert any other habit there, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, some people will eat, you know, just to go with the food example, they'll eat late at night and they sleep great. Other people will say, I can never do that because I get acid reflux or I get stomach aches. And most sleep researchers would say, you know, you should avoid a large meal before sleep. But I mean, if that's when you eat your big meal and you're sleeping fine, then you know, more power to you. And so there's definitely individual differences for sure. And this, you know, you're a person that works out a lot. You know, there's also a lot of some research indicating that you shouldn't work out too close to when you go to sleep or when you try to attempt sleep. But yet you'll always find somebody that says, well, I work out, you know, an hour before I go to bed and I sleep great. And you know, and I'm like, okay, that's good for you.
This kind of prompts the question of sort of back on sleep deprivation in the sense of, as a culture, it's very hard not to be sleep deprived from my observations. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, if you go back to the first sleep survey that our government sponsored, it was in 1911. And in 1911, the average amount of sleep was a little over 9 hours for the typical American citizen. And then that was it rode about that 9 hour wave until around World War II, and then it started to drop. And we know now that people, the total sleep time people get is between 6.5 and 7 hours, or some would say between 6.5 and 7.5 hours. So we're sleeping less now than our great grandparents, for sure.
Yeah.
And so the ramifications of that are who knows? I mean, you can't do an experiment because you'd have to go back in time to start it. And but I mean, some of the health problems that people are experiencing today, at least sleep deprivation could be a contributor to a number of factors that we're experiencing today that our great grandparents didn't experience.
Yeah. 9 hours sounds awesome.
Yeah. And the funny thing is that, I did some research, as I mentioned before, in the Navy, and the Navy did a study on submariners just after World War II. It was like 1946, 1947. And the average submariner back then was sleeping about 9.2 hours.
Wow.
And whereas today it's about 6.
Okay. In the same population?
Not the same population, but a similar environment, in a tiny tube underneath the water.
Yeah. I just feel like I got to school in high school at like 8 a.m. And so I had to get up at like 6, right?
Yeah.
I got to college. The culture in college is stay up late and study. I mean, sometimes I was up till like, whether I was studying or partying, I was up till like 12 or 1 in the morning, right?
Yeah.
And now I coach early in the morning. I understand that this is like a career thing, but I get up at like 4 or 4:30 or 5. And if I can't imagine working a 9 to 5 and having kids, because then you either get up super early if you want to work out or have any sort of routine, or you wait till your kids go to bed and then you do whatever you want to do from like 8 till 11 p.m. And then you just sort of rinse and repeat this. I feel like, just talking to you, that this is a problem that we should maybe not fix, but we're definitely not setting ourselves up for success with getting enough sleep.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think that I think you're right, and again, that points to the fact that if you sleep in, like when I was in the military, and when I had a staff job where I was not on a boat or whatever, but I was working in an office. If you showed up, 1 minute after 7 o'clock in the morning, people are like, oh, nice of you to show up for work. They called you lazy if you showed up late. And the military is a subculture of our own culture, and we admire people that put their nose to the grindstone and work to the light of the midnight oil and all these other things that we appreciate people that work hard, and working hard involves sleep depriving yourself, and that's a virtue for our culture.
Is that okay?
I don't think it is okay. And even in the military, that is a subculture that prides itself on sleep deprivation even more than the culture from which the military comes from. And and it was a struggle for me to try and convince these military commanders to try and encourage their troops to get more sleep. And on paper they'd be like, "Yeah, I get it, but this is the real world, Jeff." And and sleep deprivation is just the nature of the beast. It just comes with the territory, and they're just going to have to deal with it. And and that's most people in our culture accept that, and so I don't see it changing anytime soon.
Okay. I feel like I deal with the same sort of fight in my world, where the way that I explain exercise to people is that we're dealing with a game of energy balance. And so doing more volume of exercise might actually be detrimental to the thing you're trying to accomplish, because in line with sleep and eating well, if you can't recover from the thing that you're doing, then there's no sense in pushing your body to do X amount of volume, right? And so people again, on paper, see that and they're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But when it comes down to applying it to the real world, they're like, I don't see how doing half of the workout that I've been doing is going to make me get stronger. That doesn't make sense to people.
Right. And I think that's a good analogy. And yeah, I mean, that's an interesting perspective.
With the sort of in line with habits, have you heard of mouth taping?
Mouse taping? No.
So there's a book that came out maybe 2 years ago called Breath, and it was written by James Nestor. It was this literary journalism piece on the importance of breathing through your nose in all things, right? Like exercise, your life, mindfulness, meditation. But sleep was another one. He tells this story of, I don't even remember what specific tribe it was, but a lot of Native American tribes, when babies were born, one of the jobs of the father of the baby was to watch over it while it slept. And if its mouth opened while it was sleeping, to close the baby's mouth, right? For the first like 3 or 4 years of this person's life. Pretty much emphasizing the importance of breathing through your nose. So what a lot of people are doing, and I do this, is at night they take a little piece of tape and put it over the middle of their mouth so that they breathe in through their nose while they're sleeping. And one of the reasons why I wanted to try this is because I've always been a chronic mouth breather. Like we'll be watching a movie and my girlfriend will just reach over and close my mouth with her hand just because I'm just sitting there with my mouth open. But I have noticed profound improvements in the way that I feel when I sleep with tape covering my mouth.
Really? And that's, most people will breathe through their nose when they sleep. But to be honest, that's beyond the scope of what I know. You know more about that than I do, for sure.
Okay. And it's enough to, for example, I have more mouth tape coming in the mail today and I didn't sleep with it last night. And I feel it in my throat this morning. Like, oh, I definitely was breathing through my mouth last night.
I guess my first thought that goes through my mind is people that have deviated septums.
Yes.
You wouldn't want to tape their mouths shut.
Yeah, correct. And again, this is, I'll even say too, I'm not a researcher. I've only have my bachelor's degree. I was reading this book Breath, and there was a lot of what I call bro science in it, where I was reading it and going, okay, I don't know about this. Like I would really like to see some more information in regards to the findings but one of them was that people with deviated septums, you can't necessarily fix it. Obviously, certain people need surgery, but people with any sort of partial blockage, right, that they deal with from their nasal pathways, some people have resolved them through like breathing exercises and intentional nasal breathing.
Yeah, I'm sure some people have been able to do that, and but like you say, some people need the septoplasty to enable them to breathe out of sometimes both sides of their nose or one side of the nose or what have you. But yeah, the bro science. I'm with you. When I read stuff, especially in the pop literature, there's the red flags pop up every once in a while. And, I'm trying to think of the physiology of the air going through your nose versus going through the back of your throat. Eventually it all reaches the same location in the end. And so, I can see how their breathing through your nose would provide a little more of a filter.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is a book that I read about a year ago, so I definitely am missing a lot of details, but I think that's the main thing of your sinuses in a way act as a filter to where you get, I think the metric was 30% more absorption of oxygen through your nose than through your mouth. I don't know how accurate that was.
That's that. Again, I'm not a pulmonologist, but the absorption of oxygen occurs in the alveoli, the lungs, not in your nose. So there could be some benefits of breathing through your nose, and I'm not discounting that. But when people start trying to find the explicit reason why some of these things work, that's when I start to kind of raise my eyebrow.
Okay. I guess that's kind of another question that I had too. It seems like your approach, which I really appreciate a lot, is there's a lot of skepticism in the way that we're talking about this because just because you're a researcher, that's a philosophy that I try to take with exercise, because exercise is another thing of when people ask me questions, it's a very well, it's all circumstantial and it sort of depends, and you're going to be a little bit different sort of approach to it. Is sleep the same?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, yeah, yes. I mean, because kind of like we were talking before, there are short sleepers and there's long sleepers, and even within the range of what's considered normal sleep, 7 or 8 hours, some people need 8, some people need 7, and it's just individual differences for sure. And so, yeah, and I am skeptical, and as a researcher, you're supposed to be skeptical, and so. Yeah, that's why some of these things they could be right. I mean, going back to the nose thing, maybe that does increase absorption, but I'm skeptical.
Okay, cool. We talked about this at the beginning. Your research sort of covers a wide variety of topics. Is there anything recently that you found that's super fascinating that you'd like to share?
Well, the fascinating thing that I guess I've already shared it is this: how sensitive we are to light, and how light can negatively impact our sleep, and as a function of that, our circadian rhythms. And so, I mean, and this is a problem for worldwide for the industrialized countries, is people are looking at their phones at midnight, and your brain, and there's that structure in your brain, that suprachiasmatic nucleus that we talked about earlier. It's trying to figure out what time of day it is, and if you're looking at your phone at midnight, as far as it's concerned, that's the sun.
Is there anything, for example, this goes back to, yeah, but this is the real world, Jeff. What are we
Right.
going to do? Sort of thing. Is it as simple as we just need to stop looking at our phones?
Well, I mean, no, because it's not. That's never going to happen. And I mean, it's an interesting question, Joel. But it's just not going to happen. And so we resort to other ways to get around the fact that that our brains are primitive, and they only, the brain thinks that light is the sun. And so, given that, we figured out that the frequency of the light signature is, if it's a bluish light, that is worse than red light. So we have these filters, and your phone probably has it built in, and it's called night shift, and it blocks some of the blue light. That is what the brain responds the most to when it comes to whether the sun is up or the sun isn't up. So we do that, and that may help a little bit, but it doesn't solve the problem.
Is there anything that you specifically do for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, believe me, I use the night shift. And so all my phones, if you look at it, if I'm on my phone at midnight, it kind of has a red hue because the blue's been filtered out.
Okay. I use the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it can help, but, it's not the panacea. It would be, if we could stop using our phones, it would probably improve. If we stop using our phones at night, it would probably improve the sleep of a lot of people.
Okay. Let's talk about naps. Is this something that you look into? Are naps good to offset some of the?
Yeah, I mean, naps are really good. I mean, but napping is somewhat of a controversial topic even among sleep researchers. But I mean, I'm on board with the idea of that more. If you feel the need to take a nap, then you're responding to the physiological need of your body, and you should take that opportunity if you have the opportunity. And there's tons of research that the Army has done showing that even really short naps can be beneficial to your cognitive performance several hours subsequent to taking that nap. And so I think it's important for people that are taking naps during the day to make sure that they're not longer than a half hour.
Okay.
And that's because if you sleep longer than a half hour, you might get into a deeper stage of sleep, and then you wake up from that deep stage of sleep and you feel kind of groggy. And so it kind of depends on what your goals are. And in the Army, the goal was to wake up and feel very alert. And so they would take these 10-minute naps, and this improved their performance.
I have a question about this. I am somebody who, I'm not a very good napper. Like if you told me to sleep in the afternoon, I would just lay there and I'd get up and just be tired for the rest of the day until I got the opportunity to sleep at night. I know people are like that too.
Yeah.
I do this thing sometimes where if I'm really tired, I'll lay down, and the whole time in my head, I'm conscious thinking, man, I will never fall asleep. And then 15 minutes goes by and the alarm goes off that I set on my phone. And I don't have any concept of the time that just passed. I feel like I just took a quick nap. I got up and I was like, oh, I think I just slept. Is that what I'm doing, or is that something else?
Yes, that's what you're doing. You're taking a short nap, just like what the Army prescribes for its soldiers in the field, and other. It's not just the Army, but the Army has done most of this research.
Okay.
So yeah, you're taking a short nap. You're going into a shallower stage of sleep, stage 2 sleep, and that can have some benefits, and that has lots of benefits. Again, for cognitive processing, and thought processing, and decision making, subsequent to that nap for several hours. And so these short naps, the what you just described, is a perfect example of a beneficial short nap.
It doesn't equate, though, to getting a good full night's rest. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, there's nothing replaces a full night of uninterrupted sleep of at least 7 to 8 hours. That's right.
Okay. If somebody who is really, maybe they're a night shift worker, or their lifestyle is just not conducive for sleeping through the night or sleeping at good quality times, maybe they struggle with napping as well. Are there any things that they can do? I know we've already talked about habits, but like, I don't want people to sit here listening like I have no hope, right? Is there anything that is like, what is the severity of an individual who's in that phase of their life, long-term overall for their health? Does that make sense?
If you're saying if they have poor sleep quality, and that their lifestyle doesn't support a sleep pattern where they have protected sleep at night and maybe a short nap during the day, they're scattered all over the place. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like how screwed are those people?
Well, if they're short sleepers because they're not getting enough sleep, and so the correlational data would indicate that their lifespan will be shorter than people who have more normal sleep. They're more likely to have get ill. People that are sleep deprived are just, their immune system just doesn't work as well. But they're not doomed. I mean, again, this is correlational data, and some people can handle sleep deprivation better than others.
This is my last question on this in regards to take a person who's a career nurse, right? They, from the age of 22 to 40, they work the night shift. This is them. They're getting 6 hours of sleep. They don't nap. They feel horrible all the time. And then they make a career change to something that is less intense. And then they all of a sudden start getting 9 hours of sleep every night and they feel awesome. Is that enough over time to offset the years that they went through? Or is that something that is, you can't repair that?
Well, that's a question that's driving some of the research. I mean, we looked at the fact that, in the submarine community, these are sleep deprived people, and we looked at retired submariners and what they, and presumably when they left the submarine service, they were sleeping a lot better than they were beforehand. And we didn't find any differences from the control group, which was other Navy people who weren't on submariners, and civilians who had daytime jobs and stuff like that. And so the mortality and morbidity wasn't any different. And so that's the good news.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that is hopeful. I think about that often with, like, I get up so early. In my head, I'm like, okay, hopefully in 10 years, I can get up later and sleep a bit more. And this gives me hope that it will return to normalcy. Right.
And that's the hope. But again, the population that we looked at was somewhat limited, and some of the limitations were it's hard to generalize submariners which are kind of a unique population even for the military, and to generalize them compared to the average person walking the street. But we didn't find any major differences between their lifespan or stuff like that.
Okay. Is there anything else that you would like to add for people listening on sleep or the importance of it?
I think one thing that I like to emphasize is that sleep it's not a passive process. It's not something that your brain, falls into by working hard throughout the day. That there are brain structures that work really hard and to put you to sleep, and there are brain structures that their job is to generate sleep, and it's not a function of how hard you work. It's not a function of how lazy you are or anything like that. It's a physiological process, just like, your insulin is a physiological process.
Cool. Meaning like, don't feel bad if you're sleeping a lot.
Right. Don't feel bad for sleeping a lot. And if you're sleeping short, don't think that you're so cool.
Okay. Yeah. That's good to clarify. People still to this day say things like that, which it's like the hustle culture sort of thing that I just don't understand.
It is.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, people will compare their sleep. I mean, with the submariners, for example, we did some research with SEAL team members, when they're wearing the wrist monitor, like what you're wearing, like what you wear now. This was like 20 years ago. And it became a competition as to who was sleeping the least. And so we had to stop this because that was what everybody resorted to. And that was really unfortunate. But that's a function of our culture.
Yeah. Okay. This is a very interesting question to ask you as the last question that I have. When I've asked scientists and research this question, we've asked it on every episode. It's always gotten funny answers because it's very subjective. There's not a lot of, I guess, ways to pinpoint a specific answer, but the name of the show is Good People. And my question is, through whether it's your research on sleep or all the other things you studied, or just circumstantial things that you've gathered of yourself over the course of your life, what to you does it mean to be a good person?
To be a good person?
Yeah.
Well, that's a very interesting question. That could be a fun, I start thinking about, when you say that, I think about Aristotle and about what they wrote about being a good person. And that was being a virtue. Being a good person is being virtuous, but that begets question as what is virtue? And, Aristotle would say that it's, having self-restraint. And Socrates would say the virtue is its own reward, that just doing the right thing is rewarding in and of itself. And so that virtue is something that is equated with being a good person. But, to fast forward to the modern times, it's an example of the subjective nature of reality. I mean, what's good for me, what I think makes a good person may not be the same thing that you think is a good person. And so it's part of our subjective reality that we agree on certain things, that it seems universal, like don't hurt other people or don't kill a fellow human being, that's not right. And so there seems like there's some commonality or some universal truths, but I think it's all subjective truths, and I don't think that's a bad thing. But I think we humans know, based on our upbringing and our culture, we feel like we know what's right and what's wrong. But it's subjective, and I don't think I've heard other people try to explain to me, no, there's some objective truths, Jeff, but I don't see that. I think it's all subjective.
Cool. That's a great answer. All right, Dr. Dyche. Well, I'm really thankful and grateful for you that you came on to talk about this. I think that this was an awesome episode and people will take a lot from it. If people want to look more into some of the stuff that you're doing, work that you're doing, things like that, where can they find it?
Most of the stuff that I talked about today is on the website that the National Sleep Foundation, the NSF. When people think NSF, they think the National Science Foundation, but the National Sleep Foundation has a number of really great websites that parrot the things that you and I were just discussing today.
Cool. I will include that in the bio and show notes and things like that for people to check out as well.
Okay, cool.
All right, Dr. Dyche, thank you very much for doing this. It was a pleasure to have you.
It was my pleasure, Joel. Thank you for having me.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this week's episode of Good People. If you guys are watching on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on post notifications so you never miss an episode. If you really love us, share this episode with someone you love, perhaps your grandma. We'll see you next time.